Well, welcome everyone to the first session in our spring quarter seminar series on entrepreneurship in Asian high-tech industries. I'm Richard Dasher, and I'm the instructor for this series. I'm very happy to say that the series is presented by the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center, which is an industry-funded research and education center under Stanford Global Studies. We are especially appreciative of our member companies. We have about 16 member companies now, and it's their financial support that allows us to put on this series. Stanford's not paying for it. So we're welcoming those of you who are guests. We're also very happy to welcome students who want to take the seminar series for credit. So if you're taking the goal is really to discuss the newest information and trends about what's going on in the ecosystems that support startup company creation and growth in high-tech industries in major Asia market. This will go on every Tuesday at this time. Please watch our website for the latest information. A couple of the seminars this quarter, our speakers are coming in remotely, and we're going to make them Zoom-only sessions. So be careful to make sure whether we're meeting here in person or by Zoom only. It is open to the public with no kind of commitment required, no kind of charge, and you can join either by Zoom or in person. Stanford's expectation is that if we do an in-person class, students will be here for the in-person class. So this means that to get the course credit, if you're taking this as a student, regular attendance at the classroom. And do note that we're recording these sessions, which make them available afterward. But also, we work with Stanford Video to make sure that students' privacy is not infringed. But in any case, regular attendance is the first thing. The second point for getting the course credit is to send a comment after each week's session to me by email that shows you watched the session. Basically, something that you could only have gotten by watching the session that you've learned. And of course, there's pedagogy behind this too. If you do need an accommodation to participate by Zoom or to participate asynchronously, send me an email. I understand that there are some people who are remote, even though they're full-time students, and so we need to know in advance. Any kind of questions or comments, Tyler is right with us. Tyler is our course assistant this time, and he's going to be in charge of making sure that the in-person attendance is counted in the right way, and also to me. Happy to get your email at any time. So about the comments, they should be about 60 to 90 words. I don't really care that much about the length, but it's something that you can only get by watching the session, not just by uploading the video into ChatGPT or uploading the slide deck into ChatGPT. So in this regard, the generative AI tools are considered unpermitted aid, and we would consider their use plagiarism. If your comment is unacceptable, I'll send you an email back and say, sorry, that just doesn't work. Then you have to resubmit. And so I'll give you instructions about what it needs if it's not quite to par. So today, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the context of entrepreneurship, really what's happening in the world economy. And then we'll get into entrepreneurial activity and attitudes in major Asia economies, the ecosystem trends in the economies, and we should have plenty of time for discussion at the end of the session. If you want to stop me with questions, you're welcome to stop me during this presentation. For those of you who are on Zoom, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, please do it in the chat window. but I can't see the chat window while I'm sharing slides. So I will not see your comments until I get through with my prepared remarks. Give me a heads up if there's something, okay?
Do you want to mention the survey?
The survey, the first thing that I mentioned, yes, attendance today, and we would like everybody here, not only students, but people who are our guests, to fill out an incoming survey so that we know who you are, how you found out about us, and anything special you'd like to see from the series. So please do fill out the survey today. And that will be for the student the record of your in-person attendance today. We'll send the survey out by email to students that I've already given them accommodation to participate by Zoom. Thank you. Okay, so the context. The world economy is worth about $199 trillion at purchase power parity. This is not what you would get if you actually exchanged money, but it's really what you can get for spending a certain amount of cash. So out of that, notice that the largest economy on the picture is China, not the United States, by $10 trillion. Now, if the EU is treated as one country, I think the EU still exceeds China, but it's getting kind of close. But notice that China has a per capita GDP of $27,000 and the US is $85,000. So that means there's a lot more people in China contributing to what will eventually be a much bigger economy. Also notice that because China and India, which is another very large economy, are both growing at a much faster growth rate than the world average is predicted. That's typical. As per capita GDP gets higher and higher, it becomes harder for the whole economy to grow as fast. You're adding more to an economy, so instead of continuing like this, the curve starts to taper off. That is why it doesn't feel so bad to be in an economy that's growing around 3% a year, or even in Japan or South Korea, 2% a year. That's actually on par with Western Europe, other advanced economies. But there is one huge exception. Singapore. Singapore has a per capita GDP of over $150,000. And it has experienced real GDP growth rate of 4.4% in 2024 and is predicted to be 2.0 to 2.4% last year, and that should be 2026. Somewhere between 1.9 and 3.6% in 26, and then in 27, 2.0 to 2.9%. So you see that it is very much a characteristic that the world economy is benefiting an awful lot from what you would call developing economies in Asia. They are very special in the world economy, especially because their growth is related to the emergence of a middle class. And because the middle class needs all sorts of new enabling digital infrastructure now, those kinds of opportunities are really being taken advantage of by entrepreneurs all across the region. But big B2C plays like a few years ago, Grab in Singapore, or some of the others, ATM that came out of India, have the possibility for growing to giant size. So unfortunately, the hallmark of the world economy this year is uncertainty. And of course, there are lots of reasons for uncertainty right now. Armed conflict and geopolitical tension. We don't know how long the war is going to last, much less what the real economic impact is going to be. It's still difficult to predict the impact of tariff rates. Where is AI taking us? Is this a good road or is it a dangerous road? What about who will win with AI and who will lose with AI? So the other day when, was it Meta? No, it wasn't Meta, it was Amazon. No, it was Block, the parent company of Square, announced that they would lay off 40% of their workers, and they used adoption of AI as the reason or excuse. So, where is AI going to take us in terms of what life is going to be like? There are incredible opportunities that it's bringing in. And there are other kinds of things that are disrupting supply chains, like climate change. We're still not too far away from COVID to remember what that did to the world economy a few years ago. So the result is that you have a lot more caution combined with the opportunistic behavior that motivates people to start companies and to invest in startup companies. Investment is slowing. The speed of investment money is really slow, and it's hard for just about everybody else except a small group of generative AI, incredibly amazing companies that sort of a really small group to raise capital. It's hard for venture capitalists to raise money this year because people are hesitant to make a long-term commitment to something that's not very liquid. So consumers are also starting to put off major purchases. And yet, at the same time, people are going to look for the great opportunities. If you see something that you think is a great opportunity, it's probably not the technology itself. It is easy to see value, what you can use the technology for. Something that fill needs that arise under this current uncertain conditions would be absolutely attractive, both to investors and to the markets. So I think that at least for the short and medium term, we can expect continued robust domestic market growth in developing Asia. And we're also going to see continued trade growth. What we're going to see is a realignment of the kind of supply chains away from the US-China axis. US and China have really decoupled. You might as well admit that it's decoupled. And now we're going to see China, Vietnam. We're going to see Indonesia, Japan. We're going to see a lot of other supply chains that are developing where it had been kind of dominated by the US and China. So that's the overall introduction. Let's look at the ecosystems that support startup company creation and growth. So I want to make a distinction. What's the difference between a startup and a small and medium-sized business? So startups are typically working toward exit. You start a company, you grow it up to a point, then you sell your stock, either by selling your company to a bigger company or by going public on the public market. In any case, either case, if it's for instance, if it's a public company, suddenly other people own your company. In my experience, companies here in the Valley do not have, the founders don't have more than 10 or 20% ownership of the stock by the time the company goes. So during the process, they've already sold off a lot of their stock to the venture capitalists. Startups also really focus on innovation. They're bringing something new to the world. That's why they're startups, right? But SMEs are typically focusing on long-term stability of a profitable business, the restaurant business. some sort of other service business. In an SME, change in ownership may be generational. There will be a time when the current owner retires or passes away or whatever, and somebody else has to take over. Usually the SMEs are in a more established business line, and you can have very successful SMEs that become big companies. So Mars Candy is still privately owned. And, this kind of thing is a difference. Silicon Valley is all about startups. And our model for what is a good startup really evolved along with the venture capital industry. The focus here is on startups that have the potential for incredible growth in the value of the stock of the company. Rapid, sustained growth leading to exit. Both of those things are expected by everybody involved, the entrepreneur, the people who go to work for the company, the investors, all of the people who are advising the company and mentoring the entrepreneurs. And the good thing about the Silicon Valley model is that it accommodates high upfront capital needs. If you've got a relatively expensive technology development required in order to get your product out to market. So the Valley was probably the first place where this really became systematized. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing Asia now trying to implement this system. If you put this kind of innovation system into a chart, this is what it looks like. This is how an innovation system works. First of all, this happens inside big companies all the time. Not all innovation needs entrepreneurs. There's a lot of R&D, product development that goes on in big companies. Top-down planning doesn't really involve entrepreneurs, but just about all entrepreneurship involves innovation. What you need to do is you need to put together knowledge, people, and capital into some new combination. For an innovation system to work, you have to have both sources of those three elements and dynamics that encourage them to move into a new combination. Of course, this all rides on an infrastructure. If you don't have a good infrastructure, the system won't work either. To apply this to startup company creation and the first stages of growth, look at the sources. Where are the people who are going to start a company going to come from? Yeah, they can come from universities, but by far, most of the people who go through universities like Stanford don't start a company right after graduating. They go to work for a big company, earn some money so that they can put some of their own money and get some business experience into a startup company that they create when the market timing is right. So large companies are actually a huge source of entrepreneurs in any kind of a system, as are previous startup companies. If you have an exit, a lot of the people involved with the startup company get addicted to this kind of 0 to 1 growth and really enjoy the challenges of a startup company, and they're good at it. So the people have that kind of, those are the sources. The dynamics for helping people move into a new combination would be a highly mobile labor market. The average length of time that a person stays in a Silicon Valley company is less than 2 years. Now, there are some people who stay in a company for, but on average, the length of time that someone stays in a company in Silicon Valley is less than 2 years. Social attitudes. So I decided to go to work for a startup company. I don't feel bad about that at all. Everyone here will kind of say, oh, how exciting. What's wonderful about it? Whereas in a lot of more traditional societies, it would be like, oh, are you going to be okay? The perception of opportunity is also something that encourages or will not encourage people to flow into a new startup. With regard to the money, the first kind of money that goes into a startup company is typically from an individual investor. The founders put in their money, they get their friends to invest. Then you have an angel investor, is typically the first professional investment money into a startup. But there are also other sources of funding. SBIR loans, personal loans, they do happen even here in Silicon Valley. And so the dynamics, the supply of capital versus the demand for the capital, what kind of conditions there are on financing, what kind of personal guarantees do you have to make in order to get money for your company? With regard to the knowledge angle, certainly robust R&D activities involve creating intellectual property. But it's not just the technical knowledge, it's the business knowledge. It's the kind of mindset we have in the Valley of transforming a problem into an opportunity. The attitude around here that has led to more startup companies than anything else is frustration. Something is inefficient in my life, and I'm going to fix it. Great example is how Uber got started, right? Two people were looking for a taxi in Paris after a conference one night, and there were not sufficient taxis. So that kind of frustration often leads to, converting it into an opportunity. So those are the kinds of things in the system itself. When we look at the people involved in starting a company, it's different people at different stages of growth. So for a system to work, you have to have resources not only to start the company, but to grow the company and also to make it successful at the time of the company's exit. So the people involved in starting a company are founders and advisors who receive stock. That's why they become part of the combination. If they're a paid consultant, they're probably down in the infrastructure because they're just providing a service. At the growth stage, though, you have people who are willing to go to work in a startup company and people who are capable of dealing with the chaos in a rapidly growing startup company. That's probably the distinctive characteristic of the Silicon Valley labor force, is that we've been there and done that with the startup companies so much that people are familiar with the chaos involved. If I tell somebody that I have a Series A2, is getting its second round of Series A financing in a company, I already kind of have a general sense of probably how big it is, whether they have revenue or not, what kind of activities they're going to be doing for their next round of funding. And at the time that the company has its exit, if you don't have a flexible labor market, it really disadvantages all the people who really should go on and do something else instead of just keep working for a big company. Post-exit opportunities. On the capital side, you've got friends and family at the beginning. You've got the VC funds really at the growth stage. And then what are the opportunities for exit? And the knowledge, you have to deal with what we were talking about, access to R&D output. Most of what we think about in terms of entrepreneurial skills are really company growth rather than company creation. Lean startup principles, being able to do rapid prototyping. As the company grows, managing investor relations. Critical point. Because if the investors want to go in one direction and the entrepreneur wants to go in a different direction, that can kill your company. Being able to manage rapid growth is a stage of knowledge, at a type of knowledge needed at the growth stage. And then at the exit stage, nobody talks about this when they talk about Silicon Valley. It's really how a company like Apple can go public and then become a gigantic massive world-leading company after it's a public company. That involves a shift in mindset. It involves something that is often called ambidextrous management, continuing to build new value on value you've already created, and at the same time, finding fundamentally new value. How different is Apple now than it was 40 years ago, right? It started as a computer company. Not really sure what it is now, but it has a variety of hardware and software that it's offering. Yeah, so these are the kind of things to look at. When we look at the first element to look at is the people. So the participation and attitudes toward entrepreneurship in major Asia markets. To this, so this is what, the 20-something year I've been giving this presentation once a year. I typically use the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is actually 2 annual surveys of people in more than 53 countries. Typically, more than 200,000 people worldwide participate in this survey every year. To be in the adult population survey, they will not accept data from a country that has less than 2,000 valid entries. Each one is conducted by a national team in each country. So the survey in Taiwan this year is done by the Taiwan Institute of Economic Research with money from the Taiwanese government. That's the only way that you could put together something this size, is if different governments are funding this. And one or more of the GEM offices will serve as a partner to make sure that the local surveyors comply with the standards. And if there are problems, they will decide not to allow the report. I tend not to use the data from the National Expert Survey, which is more impressionistic. It's really opinions by experts. And so for what we're doing, I really want to know what people are involved with. This has been going on every year since 1999, and the most recent one was just released last month. They also have a database of country-specific data. And this first data that I'm interested in is what they call the T rate. You gotta love the term, right? The T rate. This is total early stage entrepreneurial activity. And it's defined as this block in the middle of the diagram, which are people in the working age population who are either actually starting up a business as they do the survey, or they're managing a new business that has paid salaries for less than 3.5 years. The condition of paying salaries is when they really say the company starts. So in those 2 stages, notice that there's no distinction between startup companies and SMEs, right? You could have people starting a new restaurant and they would show up as being in the T rate in a company like this. There's also nothing in this definition to distinguish between someone who is starting a company because they think they see a great opportunity, or starting a company because there aren't any other jobs around. In an earlier stage developing economy, you typically have higher T rates because there are fewer salaried jobs in established companies. So this is the T rate. First chart to show is the T rates of the United States and the 3 big Asian economies. So the black line is the US, starting at 12.8% of the working age population were early stage entrepreneurs by their definition in 2012. And the most recent data that they've published in the database is 2024, 19.3%. So that is a rather steady up. You do see some variation. The country that sort of started out in exactly the same place was China in 2012. And China went up and had a higher T rate. In the early 2000s, the China T rate was around 20%. But since 2015, especially, you have seen a noticeable drop in the percentage of the working age population who are entrepreneurs, early stage entrepreneurs. So that shock of shocks, in 2022, a larger percentage of the working age population in Japan were actively involved as entrepreneurs than were in China. That doesn't fit the kind of reputations that these countries have. In China, it's coming from very low, 4%. I'm sorry, in Japan, it's coming from a low rate of 4% up to this 6.4% in 2022. And then there's no data from China, from Japan, I'm sorry. That is something that's kind of disturbing. The India rate has a lot of variability, which you see more in a developing economy, but gradually it's increased from about 10% to 12.2% in 2024. In 2025, they did report T rates separately for men and women, but they did not report how many men versus how many women were in their total sample. So I don't want to just take the average of the two numbers. That's why I'm not trying to add 2025 into this. In the US, 19.3% of the working age population who are men were put into the T category, and 15.9% of the women. In India, it was almost equal. 12.2% of the entrepreneurs were men and 12.5% of the entrepreneurs were women. So that's what it looks like in the giant economies, the biggest economies. If you look at what we typically call the tigers, the T rates are all lower than the T rate in the United States. The one that's closest is South Korea in shape to the shape in the United States. Unfortunately, since 2019, despite a lot of variability, and this had to do with everything from just kind of general mood toward the economy, the inflation rate, whatever, US gradually continues upward, but Korea has definitely continued downward. So in these economies, there's still a favor for prestige jobs at big companies. In Taiwan, there's been a drop from 7.5% down to 5.6% in 2024, so that this is somewhere near China, mainland China. That's a little bit of a surprise to me, and I'm not sure what's going on. Their separate report from Jim showed their 2025 T rate for men was 11.8% and for women was 8.5%. So I would expect a distinct move up somewhere in the 9-10% range for the average in 2025. This is the situation with how many people are being entrepreneurs in these economies. The developing Asia economies that I mentioned earlier are all over the place. Some T rates are noticeably higher than those in the United States. Some T rates are lower, and you see wild swings. Now, to some extent, the wild swings may be characteristic of a developing economy. This is a good year, this is not a good year. Can also be political uncertainty or instability. I think probably that's what's going on in Malaysia between 2016 and 2017, and possibly what's going on in Thailand, which has had a very high T rate, except we have a big gap here. Notice how much less data has been given since about 2018. I do hope that Jim can continue their survey, but I am a little bit worried that I may not be able to use this many more years from now because I think fewer countries are starting to give them their data. It's a lot of work. You've got to find a sponsor for it. And yeah, maybe there's not a whole lot of fame and fortune involved in doing it. One of the other things that is interesting to report on are the attitudes of the people surveyed in each country who are not entrepreneurs, the people who are not starting a company or running a company for less than 3.5 years. In the US, you see, first of all, wide range in differences, but quite high rate of people who see good opportunities for entrepreneurs in around them, in their environment. The other thing that is characteristic in the US is we're very self-confident. In 2024, 55.7% of the working age population thought that they had the skills it would take to start and run a company. The fear of failure that has kept people from being entrepreneurs has gradually increased from 32% up to 44% in the US. And the other attitude that is reported on is if a person is not actively engaged in entrepreneurship, fitting into the T category, do they have the intention to start a company within the next 3 years? In the US, those two rates had stayed very close to each other, which is pretty stable, but then they started to diverge. And I think the divergence has to do with economic uncertainty discouraging risk. So right now, only 13% of the population said that they have the intention to start a company in the next 3 years. All right, so that's the US as a benchmark. In, let's see, where is this? I can't read. India, thank you. Suddenly I switched from China and I put India first. So notice that in India, the perception of opportunities for entrepreneurs tracks extremely closely the survey respondents' perception of their own ability to run a company. And it is incredibly high. 85% of the working age population sees good opportunities for startup companies and thinks that they have the ability to do it. But notice that the fear of failure in India has also gone up to a quite high level, 71.8% from 38.9%. We started out with about 32 or 33% in the US, I think. And so it was a little high to start with, but it's definitely gone upward in India. And yet what you see more people planning to start a company in the next years that are actually engaged in entrepreneurship. So that's an indication that this is a robust system where there will continue to be a lot of new companies created every year. In China, something happened in the year 2019 that has been explained to me as a statement of government policy about promoting entrepreneurship. And so suddenly the perception of opportunity jumped up to 74%, and the perception of capability also jumped up. But after COVID, and there was no data from China during COVID, it has dropped quite a bit back. 54% of the population seeing good opportunities, and 48% of the population thinking they could start a company. At the same time, the fear of failure has gone up from about 35, 36% up to 62%. Now, notice that in India, it was higher. 71% of the population is not engaged in entrepreneurship because they're afraid of failure. But what has really happened since COVID in China is that the percentage of the population who are planning to start a company within the next 3 years had been much higher than the percentage of people actually engaged in entrepreneurship. And then suddenly the two lines are almost exactly the same. So I think we're not going to see a major increase in the number of companies in China. We're seeing a new stability, a new normal post-COVID in China. We'll see a little bit more about why that's happening when we talk about the flow of money. With regard to Japan, this is just sad. 12%, 12.7% of the population, working age population, sees good opportunities for entrepreneurship in the country. And I give them a little credit because in a lot of Asian cultures, it is not appropriate to say you're gifted yourself, right? You have to be humble. And so it could be that feeling that they don't have the ability to start a company is a little bit of cultural humility going on. But I think the biggest change is that people don't see good opportunities. The fear of failure rate at 50% is high, but not as high in India as in India or in China. So it really has to do with the perception of opportunities, and the percentage of people who are actively engaged in entrepreneurship is a little bit higher than the percentage of people who plan to start a company in the next 3 years. Uh, Japan is engaged in change, and it's really too bad we don't have data since 2023 in this survey, because anecdotally, I can say I'm seeing a lot of young people, especially in Japanese universities, who want the independence of being an entrepreneur and are willing to pay the price of uncertainty and hard work. People who are not only studying entrepreneurship, but they have their ideas and they want to get out and work with them. But this is how the entrepreneurial kind of participation looks in these countries. One last aspect I want to mention to who's being an entrepreneur. Notice that in India, even back in 2022, it was very equal, equal percentage of the male population and the female population wanted to be engaged in entrepreneurship. In most places, there are more men involved in entrepreneurial activities than women. And the two places where it was the most different were South Korea and Japan. Now, when I looked for the 2025 data, South Korea is much less different now than it was. And we don't have data from Japan. So South Korea is kind of equalizing. It was a little bit of a surprise to see, to me, that more women were involved in entrepreneurship in Indonesia than men were. And I don't know what that says about the kind of jobs that are being reported on as their startup companies or their SMEs. So entrepreneurs exist everywhere. The problem is also qualitative as well as quantitative. Who chooses entrepreneurship for a career? And it's really the stage where startup companies need to grow that the labor problem in Asia is really big. How do you get good quality people who are willing to go to work in somebody else's startup company? Especially incentivization by startup companies is not as sophisticated as it is here in the Valley. Wages tend to be cheap. There's wide differences about stock options that kind of depend on how greedy the founder is. And this does create less team cohesion. There's less of an expectation of making a lot of money at exit in a Japanese company because exit rates tend to be smaller. We'll come to that in just a minute. And there's still kind of a social stigma. The social stigma is not about being an entrepreneur now. It's about working for an unknown startup company. Are you a good risk, even for having you as a social friend or, dating or whatever? And especially in Japan, you have a much less mobile labor market and fewer mid-career hiring opportunities. So if your startup company does not work, you don't have nearly the range of options that you do here in the Valley. One other people aspect in Asia is that entrepreneurs in Asia, and this is not just Japan, tend to stay with their company after exit. This is very bad for the system. People like Steve Jobs had to leave his company. He was fired. Then he came back and ran it as a public company. Larry Page stepped back from being the CEO of Google. And 15 years later, after he really learned what it was like to be in a big company and run a big company, he came back as CEO. Different skill sets are required. And these entrepreneurs who stay with their companies aren't enriching the system by becoming serial entrepreneurs, starting a new company, or by becoming an investor. One of the issues with Asia, in places where there's not as long a history of venture capital as we have here, is that most of the people who are doing venture capitalism have a financial industry background. They don't have startup operating experience. And that just leads to a totally different kind of relationship between them and the startup company. So that's the people side. Let's talk about capital flow. So you see a giant spike in worldwide venture investment in startups in the year 2021. This was venture investors who want to be in early, seeing the ending of COVID appearing and thinking that they wanted to be early in, that the world coming out of COVID would be a great place and we want to be there. Unfortunately, inflation stayed high. And so it dropped like a rock through 2023. And then in 2025, you're seeing this coming back up. Now, what is hidden in this graph, and I could not find a chart that really showed, is the stage of investment. Worldwide, of all venture capital investment, about half of the value in 22, 23, 24, and 25 went to mega deals. So if Anthropic is raising another $10 billion of venture capital funds, that's $10 billion. That would show up on this chart. If you're a startup company trying to raise $15 million in seed funding, it takes a lot of those to show up in this chart. And so the later stage investment in these kinds of, big companies, can you really call Anthropic a startup now? They're still taking money. They're still some sort of a decacorn. That has sucked a lot of startup capital, a lot of venture capital in that direction. And so, also especially since 2023 and the launch of ChatGPT, if it's not AI, it's hard to get people to invest. You're going to have an AI widget for just about anything to get money these days. So that's the way that it looks on a worldwide scale. Looking at the situation, and this is from the same source, so you can trust these numbers to be consistent with the previous page. Of the $432 billion invested in venture capital in 2025, 213 billion of that came from the United States or went to United States startup companies. That's the way I should say it. 22.8 billion went to Chinese startup companies. 9.3 billion went to Indian startup companies. You jump down a little bit and you get to South Korea, 3.7 billion, and UAE. What? Because of the AI that they're growing. This is clearly artificial intelligence. Now, you really have to watch what everybody puts out. People forget about Japan. KPMG does their own separate survey of venture capital funding worldwide. And they showed that venture financing in Japan was $5.8 billion in 2025, up from $5.2 billion in 2024. So it would not only be somewhere around here in the chart, but it would be something where the bar that's showing increase in investment in 25 over 24 is on the positive side. That's different from all of the other big economies with venture capital going on. In China, one of the most noticeable things, and this chart kind of sort of shows it, but not really well, it's gone real domestic. Foreign investors are almost not doing anything in China anymore. There are a few exceptions, but one problem is that almost all of the investments in China have to be denominated in renminbi. Dollar-denominated investments are just not happening these days. So this is something that has been characteristic really since the COVID era. It's dropped like a rock, foreign participation. Now, in looking at 23 years of venture capital investment in China, and this is, I put this slide in because it's from a Stanford research group and nicely done. About 20 to 23% of investments in China are devoted to AI cumulatively over those 23 years. If you look after the last 2 or 3 years, over 60% of investments are going to AI startups. Worldwide, last year in 2025, 62% of all venture capital went to AI-related startup companies. In India, the track is really pretty close to the world track. You have 2021 as the spike, and then you have what Bain and company calls recalibration and recovery. Most deals in India, in complete flip to China, domestic venture capital in India developed late, so that 85 or 90% money flowing into Indian startups are coming from outside India. The areas that are popular, consumer technology, consumer retail are really growing in 2024, and also SaaS a little bit, but banking and fintech and so forth. Think about it. These are all technologies that support a new middle class. And so this is probably where you see the opportunities for growth in India. With regard to Japan, this is Japan, right? Yep. Japan had a big spike in 2021, but instead of coming down, it kept going up. This is a remarkably steep increase in the amount of funds available. And to some extent, it reflects a government policy to increase the amount of venture capital invested by 10 times over a 5-year period. Now, one of the reasons that you still see things going down in this is only half year, by the way, so you should double it, and the bar should probably be up around here for the last half of 24, is that the exchange rate between yen dollar has lost 30-40% in the last 4 years. A fund that was denominated in yen in 2022 has about 30% less spending power in dollars. And these charts are denominated in, that is yen value, but in dollars, it's been around 5 billion, 6 billion per year. What's interesting in this kind of quarterly chart for the last 5 years in Japan is that it's relatively stable. You do see variability quarter to quarter, but mostly the distinctive characteristics of venture capital in Japan is that it's almost all early stage. There are very few late stage funds, and there are almost no mega deals worth more than $100 million. Two, I could find the names of Mujin, which is a robotic software interface company, got a $235 million of investment, and Sakana AI, which is probably the closest thing that Japan has to something like OpenAI or Anthropic, got $135 million. And yes, this is denominated in dollars, so the yen amounts have been really going up to support this dollar denomination value. In South Korea, you see the same kind of thing related to an exchange rate. The South Korean won has dropped like a rock, so the number of deals has stayed relatively constant, but the value of the deals has been going down. One of the interesting things, though, about Korea is that Korea is growing its companies extremely well. And the next thing to look at is going to be unicorns. But before that, just one slide on Southeast Asia. Notice how Southeast Asia, after this kind of thing around 2021, has really dropped. So that really only $3 or $4 billion of venture capital was invested all across Southeast Asia. There was over $21 billion of uninvested venture capital held by venture capital companies in Southeast Asia. So the money is really not moving. And also, especially in Singapore, they're investing outside the region. And a Singaporean investor will invest in everything from Dubai to Silicon Valley and even in Europe. Singapore dominates Southeast Asia venture capital. 78% of all the investments are coming from Singapore. And the popular investment areas, according to the studies that I read, are digital infrastructure for AI and cloud services, and also enablers for the middle class. So the digital infrastructure, that's enabling business. And so I think you're seeing a B2B2C kind of play, where the IT infrastructure for across the region is becoming much more up to par with the rest of the world. So yeah, this is the point I wanted to make about what happens to a company after exit. This is a comparison of the market caps of our superstar companies in the Silicon Valley area on the day that they went public and today. Easy to find this information if you've got the right application on your phone, right? And to grow like that, you have to create a company with global expansion in its blood from the very beginning. And also, it has to develop the ability to grow a lot better than its industry can grow. One of the main ways that companies do this is through open innovation with startup companies here. That has not developed in Asia so much. Now, there is an exception to this. China has a record of building some global companies. Xiaomi, their market cap today was $824 billion. Okay, it's not $1 trillion company, but it's getting close. This kind of growth after a company becomes public is really why Silicon Valley is so well known. If we didn't have these companies in the neighborhood, if we were just the startup companies that had not made their names yet, people wouldn't pay as much attention to us. So sure enough, because we have this attitude toward growing things as much as possible, even before exit, we create a lot of unicorns. about 20% of the world's unicorn companies are located in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And so that's not too surprising. But remember that slide that showed U.S. invested $200 billion of venture capital in 2025, and China invested 22.8 billion or something like that. Look, China already has 875 unicorns that it has created in the last 10 years. So it's done extremely well with growing its companies up to large size, and maybe doesn't quite feel the pressure to take them public that entrepreneurs feel elsewhere. India has 120 unicorn companies, and South Korea has 25. That is impressive given the amount of venture capital that has been invested. Japan has a handful, right? 10 or 11, something like that. And Singapore is the only other Asian economy here that has 36 unicorn companies in cumulatively between 2015 and 2025. One last thing about the exit pattern. Acquisition is the dominant exit pattern for startup companies worldwide. More than 10-to-1 ratio, companies that exit getting bought by a big company versus going IPO or going IPO via a SPAC. This is not failure. Being acquired by a big company is not regarded as failure in the United States if all of the people who invested in the startup company and who worked in the startup company are well rewarded, and the big company will take advantage of what the startup company has. Sometimes going to a big company lets you use their distribution, lets you use their manufacturing capacity, lets you use their supply chain, lets you use their brand even. So worldwide, M&A is the story, not in Asia. In Asia, especially since 2021, the end of COVID, the numbers of M&A exits have dropped like a rock. And they're down not so much beyond what the number of exits by IPO are. So this is an issue because I think that a robust system needs to have this open innovation where the big companies are taking advantage of the new ideas and the energy of the startup companies. That's one reason our superstars have done well here. Alphabet acquires between 8 and 12 startup companies every year for the last 10 years. Before the last 10 years, it was more like 15 to 20 every year. So that's kind of the situation with the flow of capital. I have one slide on the flow of knowledge. You have advanced R&D in Japan, Korea, and China. And what is happening all across Asia is much more emphasis on innovation by the government for the organizations that do the advanced R&D. This is great, but what I'm missing all across Asia is the recognition that everybody should learn business as well as learning their technical area. A little bit of business knowledge is really important if you're going to go into computer science. Not what they've done is they've picked out the entrepreneurs and said, oh, we need to create entrepreneurs in the economy. And so the number of people who are studying entrepreneurship, okay, that's some people who are kind of hardcore and they really want to be entrepreneurs. But who's going to go to work in the startup companies? They need some business knowledge before they graduate, and that's kind of missing. Also, unfortunately, kind of missing in Asia is mentoring. This is not that people don't have the ability to mentor. It has to do with less flow from one sector to another. The investors in startup companies typically have financial backgrounds in most Asia economies. And that's always been something that the Valley has worried about. Too many VCs are really, coming from MBA programs where they studied finance, not from operating a startup company. That has always been a worry here, and people haven't even noticed it to worry about it in Asian economies. I do think that there are certain considerations of face in some Asia economies that make it harder to do mentoring. I think that as more foreign venture investors start to get interested in the growth opportunities in Asian markets, this is going to force the startups to become more sophisticated. It's also probably going to force valuations to go down. In some ways, there's too much venture capital chasing a relatively limited number of startup companies in most major Asian economies. And that means that it's too easy to get more money for each share of stock. I think that the more you have tough love from investors who are used to the situation here, this will improve. And I think open innovation is absolutely a key. That it's not just creating startup companies that can grow and do good things, it's creating big companies that know how to benefit from those new ideas because they comprise a big part of the GDP as well. And you need it to work in an integrated way. So that's my prepared comments. We have coming up next week, really, how is the startup ecosystem growth having societal impact in India? And then in 2 weeks, I picked this topic because one of the things that is clearly happening now is massive attention to the security relationship and to that kind of development. Frank is a Stanford master's student, and it will be good to have him come back and talk about it. He's been living in Japan for 20-something years now. And then Sega Chang is coming in on the 21st to talk about the Taiwan AI Futures Initiative. We have another kind of sector-specific topic on the 28th, space industries in Japan. We will take a bye week on May 5th. And then very interesting company, ULAP Networks, which allows voice and data communications to proceed unimpeded across borders with different regulatory regimes and different kinds of firewalls and so forth, national firewalls. So that company is actually based in Brunei, but it came from the Philippines. And then we're looking at a South Korean company on the 19th. And I'm talking to a couple of people for the 26th of May and the 2nd of June. I didn't have space on the slide. So that's my topic for today. I would be delighted to take some questions if you have it. Feel free to reach out to me or to our other organizers with anything that we can do to make the series more meaningful. Thanks very much for your attention. Let me see if I can get the chat window. It has on chat. Maybe it's on the floor. Questions or comments?
One of the slides showed there was a steady amount of early stage funding for Japanese startups, but fewer numbers of mega deals.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the Japanese startups are under more pressure to achieve profitability sooner rather than later?
Yep. It does. It also means that the venture capital industry is structured so that there are very few late stage funds. They do exist, and there are some that kind of started out as late stage, but then they've been drifting into earlier and earlier stage investments. So With that situation, the pressure in Japan is to give investors an early payback. This also reflects the kind of financial industry background. So earlier exit means smaller exit. And so you have a lot of companies on the Japanese stock exchange, new companies that really shouldn't be there yet. Very good question. Good comment. Other questions? Go ahead.
Richard, can you tell us about the difference in the LP ecosystem in the United States, say Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Research Triangle Park, and contrast that with Asia? And has there been any significant impact with Gulf states' investments in AI?
That's a great question. I haven't specifically looked at the impact of the Gulf states. What's happening now with the slowdown in the speed of investment money is that the LPs are only investing in the name brand VCs. So you've got core VCs, a relatively small group like A16Z or whoever. They can raise, fund 25 if they need to. But the other VCs that are on fund 3 or 4, they're having trouble raising money. Now, there is one really amazing difference between Japan and other Asian economies. Most of the LP money in Japan are big corporates who have strategic interests as well as financial return interests. And that is, they're also investing in name brands right now. And if they're investing in a name brand fund, they can't have too much influence over the way the investments are done. But for medium-sized funds in Japan, they do have things they're expecting besides just a good return on the money. They want investments in companies that their company might be interested in doing business with. So that kind of corporate investment in Japan is part of 80 to 85% of all deals, as opposed to purely financial investments. Now, I think that in China, the distinctive feature is government money. And a lot of government money looks like it's private money, but if you go back one LP level, you see that it's really invested by not only the central government, but regional governments. City governments and state governments in China were incredibly active in getting involved in venture capital investment between 2015 and 2020. That's what I can say about the nature of the LPs right now. Good question. Thank you. Other questions?
We do have one on Zoom.
Go ahead, Jerry, you first.
Yeah, I want to follow up a little on what Ed asked, but do you have enough data to compare and contrast the LP profile of Singapore in particular with US, Silicon Valley? I'm really interested because Singapore is kind of the dynamic engine.
Yeah, to me, the uniqueness of Singapore is it's one of the few government industry kind of coalitions that seems to work. There's a lot of government money in Singapore, but this is one of the few places in the world that it truly has a global outlook in what's going on. If you want to see emerging trends in Eastern Europe, you might go to Singapore to see what's happening. I don't really know, specifically who's investing in the fund. There's a lot of Asian in these large business groups. The Lee family that's behind Samsung. There's half a dozen families like this in Hong Kong. Most Asia business outside Japan and Korea are really the gigantic company conglomerates have families pretty close to the surface, and those families have foundations. I think they're doing a lot of investing in these alternative investments, and it's a level bigger than the typical family office. But other than that, banks, insurance companies, pension funds, university endowments, it's kind of the usual game. Thanks. So this one, our sovereign wealth funds in GCC.
Both countries?
Thank you. Gulf Coast countries that have catapulted UAE's VC ecosystem. Yes, there's a lot of that. And it was a stated intention by the UAE government to have their own, AI model. They now have one that's really competing with the big ones, Claude and whatever. So I think that yes, you do see the sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East being active worldwide. For a big fund like that, venture capital is an alternative high-risk investment that requires a long-term commitment of capital. It's really hard to get your money out before 10 or 12 years later. And so it will never be, should never be, the majority investment of kind of a completely managed fund like that. But yeah, the sovereign wealth funds are definitely there. So you mentioned that normally the founders in Silicon Valley startups typically hold less than 20% of the company share. I feel the founders of Japanese startups typically hold the majority of shares of the company. Do you think such owner company type of shareholding may be hindering the growth of the Japanese startups in Japan? Yes. Think about it. How do you value the shares of a company if the market can only buy 20% of the shares? And I've seen a lot of Japanese companies go public where the owner is going to hold on to 60 or 70% of the shares even after the company is public. The other thing that it prevents is it really prevents the owner from learning the differences of running a successful big company from running their successful startup company. So it does hinder the growth of the individual startups, and it certainly hinders the system because it doesn't encourage more mobility in the system. Yeah, great question. Other questions? Back in the back.
I hope you can hear me. So you mentioned earlier in your presentation about the company CEO who laid off 40% of his staff. I think it was Square.
Yeah, the parent of Square, Block.
Square. And the reason given, we all know about, we read the media about it, was AI.
Yeah.
About that. So I don't think anybody would sue with that. But one thing I wanted to ask you about that is, I think maybe that company and others, asking your opinion, they're using AI 100% excuse when over hiring during the pandemic is more a big part of it than you're willing to admit. Why are they not admitting it? Because they made a mistake. They overhired. So they're blaming it on AI. I was curious if you see that.
I think that in our system in the United States, you're less likely to be sued for laying somebody off if you say you're replacing them with AI than if you say that we've just got to reorganize and we don't need you. That becomes a subjective kind of valuation. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of it is they're making AI wear the black hat. But I also think that with AI, if people's productivity increases that much, how does that affect the labor force? Some people will be incredibly productive. What does everybody else do? Are we really going to have that kind of massive increase in production? Can you produce enough more stuff to keep these people employed? And we just don't know. I see, the impact of AI on the labor force is a topic every other day, but nobody knows. And I think that on the one hand, there are some people who say that people won't know how to use all their leisure time. You know, that's been said for the last 60 years with information technology. There was a prediction made in front of the American Congress in the early 1960s that due to AI, people would only have to work a 15-hour week. Yeah, right. It really worked out that way, didn't it? So, you know, that's not going to happen. But I do think that that's one of the uncertainties. We really don't know what will happen. So I'm afraid we're out of time for the class today. We've got some refreshments outside for those of you who are here. Be happy to stand around and talk a little bit more and find out what you're interested in. Please turn in your surveys if you haven't done that already. And look forward to seeing you next week with Dr. Thanks, everybody.